when you joined film school, you got pretty jaded by it, by the pretentious nature of it. And then around that time, you took a class with the actor Ivory Ocean, who introduced you to some improv exercises.
Okay.
And then around that same time, your friend Kevin Dove convinced you to go to some classes at Improv Olympic as well. And then you were hooked onto it completely. You were there in Chicago when the Mount Rushmore of improv performers were there, either at the IO or at Second City. And then later on, you were pretty critical in building the improv community in New York as well. You helped UCB set up a theater. You then founded The Pit, and then you founded Magnet. So I feel like you're one of the best people to answer this question. What are the differences between these two heavyweights, New York and Chicago, in terms of improv, comedy, and theater? Are there any defining traits between the two cities, if at all?
Well, I think less so. When I first came out here, definitely there was like a big difference. But because of the internet and because of people traveling all over the world, when we would first, in Chicago, we'd get invited out to go to different cities because they would have like some kind of comedy festival and they were doing improv, and the kind of improv they were doing was just short form improv. And so they hadn't done long form. And so it was just very much like, whose line is it anyway? Just like quick pass, And so you'd go out there one year and you just like start to teach them a little bit of long form. And then you'd go out there a couple years later, and then suddenly now there's like 2 long form improv theaters formed, And so the seeds started kind of just sprouting. And so that dissemination, that cultural diffusion is just like occurred over the decade. So when I first came out to New York, UCB was teaching classes and doing shows out of a theater called Soul Arts, and so they were only ones doing long form. And then there was like Chicago City Limits, where they would do comedy reviews, and they did improv, and a lot of it was like improv games, things like that. And so New York real estate, just terms of like stage time and space and rehearsal space and things like that was like very limited. Like in Chicago, rents were, less, and people usually had, decent sized apartments with a big living room, and so you could rehearse in that living room, and you didn't have to rent a studio and pay, like $50 an hour, same thing with stage. So UCB was renting per hour from this, so renting Thursdays and Saturdays and Sundays. So, so there was like a premium on time. And so the shows had to be in and out at a certain point, so there was like a little bit more discipline. And the other thing is the stages were smaller, so in that way, like it was a little bit more standing and talking heads kind of scenes that were going on, at UCB, because it's like, well, we only got 4 feet, and, so it was very verbal. Whereas in Chicago, stages are bigger, but then also they had accompanists. So you would have a piano player during the whole show, and they would underscore what you're doing. And, sometimes it would turn into a song. So it was just kind of like a little bit of a slower pace, and something had a little more breathing room to it. On the sort of bad end of the spectrum would be that things would get kind of, sort of aimless and just go on forever. And, and people would just kind of get lost in whatever sort of rabbit hole they went down. And so that would be the downside of it. But on the plus side, there would be like room for discovery or room for more physical work, whereas with UCB, it was all about, results, you only had limited time. And so there was kind of a little bit more attack level of play in it. And so, New York being kind of being a very competitive town, highly educated people, people who are, well exposed to many different arts and things like that, like a bit harder to get a laugh, like where, in Chicago, it'd be like, oh yeah, like if you were just kind of whimsical, that'd be fine. But here you had to really, be smart and edgy, and so that had been like the kind of the nature of the style that was going on with UCB Improv. But then over time, because there was this kind of crossover and and I spent a lot of time trying to work on physical work with people and discovery, and whereas like UCB is kind of like, well, we only got an hour here, we got to get them in, get it out, what I mean? So everything they were doing was under the clock and just trying to sort of be able to pay the rent, and so I remember like I used to teach from 9 to 6 on Saturdays and Sundays, no lunch break, no break. Just like a chance for a quick bathroom break, what I mean? So, because it was just like they needed the money. So, so you're doing 9 hours, doing 18 hours in 2 days, straight class, come in, they come out, boom, boom, and so, so I was like, okay, I adapted to it. And I was like really on board because I was like, I believed in the mission of like what we're trying to do and anything I do to contribute, to this being successful. But, again, it was just like kind of this like New York sort of driven, like, you can wait for somebody to give up a seat on the subway or you could take the seat, And so that was kind of the thing. It was like, you got to go get it. So that was kind of the difference between the two places.
Can I tell you how much I love these type of insights, that these little nuances of the city shapes so much of the theater, that the art form that comes out of it. You mentioned the size of the theater is smaller, so like the style of theater that you create is much different. The rental cost is it's more a tax style of improv. You also mentioned in the previous interview that the weather in Chicago is much colder, so it beats down on people. So the kind of performers who show up have this innate sense of humility to them as compared to the people in New York.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also want to throw a third city into the mix, Los Angeles. Is there a difference in theater in Los Angeles?
Los Angeles, biggest industry town in the world for, entertainment, And so in Los Angeles, it's a driving city. So in terms of environment that, can't get anywhere unless you have a car most of the time. So you walk around, people are going to think you're some kind of drifter, murderer or something like that. Like there's something wrong with you if you're walking. But also it's impossible. You're going to like walk 8 miles to get someplace. And so it's hard to get audiences in New York, in Los Angeles, like that they would do a show and be like, oh, there's only 8 people here. And they'd be like, oh, that's great. We got an audience. Like, because nobody wants to have to drive, it's just such a pain in the butt. Like I remember visiting and trying to see my friends like, hey man, I'm here. Let's all, like, oh, who's going to drive and blah, blah. Like nobody wanted to like, so it wasn't like a big audience for theater. So that was like one thing. And the other thing is that like the shows were all kind of like auditions, like they were, it felt like many people treated them like there was like a showcase for them to get, seen by an agent or by a casting agent or something like that. And so sometimes you get the feel that like a few people would like showboating, be like that, that was kind of like, they're just, they're kind of playing for them, and so that was never like, the shows. I felt, sometimes when people played that way, it was to the detriment of it, I haven't been out there in a long time, so I haven't seen a show. I'm not saying all shows are like that, but there's a little bit of vibe sometimes like that.